After France surrendered in June 1940, Wehrmacht commanders held private debriefs about what had actually happened. The conclusions were not what you would expect from an army that had just conquered Western Europe in 6 weeks. On May 13th, Heinz Guderian's Panzer Corps crossed the Meuse at Sedan, pushing well beyond what his orders permitted. 7 days later, his tanks were on the English Channel, 150 miles behind the strongest army in Western Europe. French commanders were handed at least 2 opportunities to cut the armored column off. Both times, their orders arrived 48 hours after the window had closed. The debriefs kept returning to the same conclusion. This shouldn't have worked. Senior Wehrmacht officers were telling each other privately that France had made mistakes Germany had no right to expect. That the same operation against a competent opponent would have failed. They were right. 3 years later, Germany invaded the Soviet Union expecting the same result. The Soviet Union had spent those 3 years studying exactly what happened at Sedan. The word Blitzkrieg does not appear in a single Wehrmacht operational order from the entire war. The Germans called what they were doing Bewegungskrieg, maneuver warfare, and the concept wasn't new. It ran back through Prussian military doctrine to Helmuth von Moltke in the 1860s, built around the same core idea: move faster than the enemy can think, encircle before they can respond, destroy the ability to coordinate rather than fighting the army directly. What changed in 1940 was the technology that finally made it work the way the doctrine had always promised it would. German tanks carried radio receivers, and command vehicles carried transceivers, so an entire armored formation could move on a single command voice in real time, without runners or flags or waiting for a telephone line that might not reach the front. French tank crews communicated by flag signal. German company commanders drove through gaps in the French line the moment they saw them, while French commanders 6 links up the chain were still being told the gaps existed. Every major army in Europe understood this kind of warfare in theory. The British had Fuller and Liddell Hart writing about armored doctrine since the 1920s. The Soviets had Tukhachevsky developing deep penetration operations before Stalin shot him in 1937. The French had de Gaulle arguing for concentrated armor as early as 1934. Germany was simply the first to put it into practice at scale, and the first to find an opponent that gave it the right conditions. The plan that broke France wasn't even Germany's preferred plan. Erich von Manstein had been arguing for an Ardennes thrust since October 1939. Drive the main armored force through the forest the French considered impassable, cut behind the Allied armies in Belgium, and destroy the entire Allied position in one stroke. The General Staff dismissed it as reckless. Halder had Manstein transferred to command an infantry corps forming in Stettin specifically to get him out of the conversation. Then, in January 1940, a Luftwaffe staff officer crash-landed in Belgium carrying a copy of the original conventional plan. The Allies recovered the documents. With the original plan compromised, Manstein got his meeting with Hitler on February 17th. Hitler overrode Halder. The Ardennes Plan was adopted. The strategy that conquered Western Europe in 6 weeks was a proposal the German General Staff had spent months rejecting, approved under pressure because a crashed plane forced a decision. Even Manstein expected the Sedan crossing to take weeks of grinding resistance. What the French command actually gave him was something different entirely. The French army in May 1940 had more tanks than Germany, more men, and better armored individual vehicles. The Schabian beasts outweighed and outgunned anything in the German inventory. One of them, named Ur, commanded by Captain Pierre Bayot at the village of Stonn on May 16th, survived 140 hits from German panzers and took out 13 of them, 11 Panzer IIIs and 2 Panzer IVs, without a single shell penetrating its armor. It also had a one-man turret, which meant the commander loaded, aimed, fired, and commanded the tanks simultaneously. The best armored vehicle on either side was being run by one man doing 4 jobs at once. Guderian's armor began crossing the Meuse on May 14th. By May 20th, his tanks were on the English Channel, and the strongest Allied armies were trapped in Belgium, cut off from France, from their supply lines, from each other. The entire Allied strategic position had been destroyed in 6 days. The campaign came close to failing before it got there. Between Guderian's lead tanks and the following infantry, there were gaps of open countryside, flanks exposed, supply lines stretched thin, the spearhead racing ahead with nothing protecting it on either side. The British hit those flanks at Arras on May 21st with 74 Matilda tanks, and when the Germans opened up with their standard 37mm anti-tank guns, the shells bounced off 80mm of frontal armor. Rommel personally directed his 88mm flak guns into the direct fire line, because those were the only weapons he had that could stop what was coming at him. For several hours, the advance was in genuine danger of collapse before the counterattack stalled and Rommel's line held. The French High Command operated from the Château de Vincennes outside Paris, a medieval fortress with not a single military radio. Gamelin had banned radio communications for fear of German interception, so orders traveled by telephone and motorcycle courier, and by the time they reached frontline units, the situation they described had already changed. When Gamelin was replaced by Weygand on May 19th, an emergency handover in the middle of a collapsing battle, the courier system he had built stayed in place. On May 24th, Rundstedt issued a halt order, worried about exhausted armor and exposed flanks after the shock of Arras. Then Hitler confirmed it. 338,000 British and French soldiers escaped from Dunkirk because the German armor sat still for 3 days, and the same flaw that had nearly broken the advance at Arras, armor outrunning its own support, produced the decision to stop. Germany won the France campaign against an opponent whose command couldn't respond in time, whose best tank was hobbled by a one-man turret, and whose government collapsed while parts of its army were still fighting. What the senior staff said privately in the weeks afterward was that none of it had been guaranteed. And then they began planning the same operation against the Soviet Union, on a frontier 4 times longer, against an opponent that had been watching Sedan from the beginning. In 1940, Germany produced approximately 1,888 combat tanks. The Soviet Union produced 2,800. This was the year Germany supposedly proved that Blitzkrieg was an unstoppable war machine, and the Soviets were already outproducing it by nearly 1,000 units. Up to 80% of the Wehrmacht's logistics was horse-drawn throughout the entire war. The panzer divisions got the newsreels. But behind them, German infantrymen marched on foot, and supply columns moved at the pace of horses, as they had in 1870 and 1914. The army that had conquered Europe in 6 weeks moved its artillery, its ammunition, and most of its food on animals, and those animals could not keep up with tanks in Russia any more than they could have in France, except that in France the campaign ended before the gap had to be resolved. The Wehrmacht's truck-based supply system could sustain an advance of roughly 310 miles from the nearest railheads before the fuel consumed by the supply trucks themselves began to cannibalize their cargo capacity. 310 miles from the Soviet border was roughly Smolensk, short of Moscow, short of the Caucasus, short of Leningrad. They launched Barbarossa anyway, betting the Soviet government would collapse before the supply system did, because they had watched France collapse politically after its army was broken and saw no reason the same logic wouldn't apply to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was not France. The director of the Panzer Museum at Münster put it best. They went to France expecting World War I reloaded and got Blitzkrieg. They went to Russia expecting Blitzkrieg and got World War I reloaded. Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941 with 3 army groups, 3 million men, and the same operational principles that had destroyed France in 6 weeks. The border battles were enormous German victories. The Red Army lost 2,000 tanks in the first week, 4,000 in the first month, 3 million prisoners by October. The Wehrmacht closed to within artillery range of Moscow. The Soviet Union did not collapse. The plan had depended on speed. A decisive political collapse within 8 to 10 weeks, the same timeline France had taken. By mid-July, Germany was already behind schedule, and the Soviet Union kept generating reserves the planners had not believed existed, divisions that had been destroyed reappearing weeks later with new equipment. Stalin did not evacuate Moscow. He stayed in the Kremlin, executed the commanders of the collapsed Western Front on charges of cowardice and catastrophic failure, and sent every available reserve west. At the Soviet border, the Wehrmacht had hit a physical wall it had not fully planned for. Western European trains ran on standard gauge track 1,435 millimeters wide. Soviet track ran at 1,524, and every ton of ammunition, fuel, and food had to be manually transferred between the 2 systems at the border while the front continued moving east. The roads turned to mud in October and froze in November. Panzer divisions that had crossed France at 30 miles a day were receiving fuel rations for 10. The Wehrmacht reached the suburbs of Moscow and stopped 310 miles past where the supply system could reach. Blitzkrieg had run out of road in front of Moscow, but the Soviets had spent 6 months losing every major engagement and watching very carefully how each one had been lost. The Americans spent 3 years studying what Germany had done at Sedan. Frank Capra made a film about it in 1943. A military officer standing in front of an animated map explaining the German technique with mechanical accuracy. He was right about the mechanics. He was wrong about what they meant. The Soviets figured it out by fighting it. Between 1941 and 1943, Soviet attempts at large-scale mobile counter-offensives repeatedly collapsed into catastrophic encirclements because the officer corps Tukhachevsky had trained before Stalin purged him was gone, and junior commanders were relearning combined arms operations under fire at enormous cost. But what they were learning was specific. The German approach depended entirely on concentrating force at a single point and breaking through before the defender could respond. It stopped working the moment the Red Army learned to keep mobile reserves within reach of wherever the breakthrough came. The Soviet answer was to attack at 5 or 6 points simultaneously across a front too wide for German reserves to cover. Mass artillery at all of them, then feed everything through whichever breakthrough actually opened. The Germans couldn't concentrate against one point when 6 were threatened at once. They added Maskirovka on top of that. Entire army groups moving at night, radio units transmitting false signals from empty positions, dummy tank parks built while the real concentration assembled elsewhere, so that German reserves would be stripped from the wrong sector to meet an attack that never came, and the actual assault would hit a line that had just been emptied. Operation Bagration. June 1944. 6 simultaneous offensives, nearly 200 miles deep. Army Group Center, the strongest German formation on the Eastern Front, was destroyed in 3 weeks. 28 divisions ceased to exist. The Soviet Union killed more German soldiers in those 3 weeks than Germany had lost in the entire France campaign. By 1944, the Americans were running the same approach at Saint-Lô and Operation Cobra, the British at Falaise. Every army that had studied what Germany did in 1940 had learned to replicate it at a scale Germany could not match, against an army that by then had neither the fuel to respond nor the reserves to absorb another blow. The doctrine the Germans never named had been decoded, replicated, and turned against them. Germany went to France and found that combined arms, speed, and a broken French command had produced something the world didn't have a name for yet. It went to Russia expecting to repeat it, and found an opponent that had spent 3 years working out exactly how it had been done. The German army that conquered Europe in 1940 was not the unstoppable machine the legend describes. It was an army that found the right conditions once, an opponent that couldn't respond in time, a plan adopted under pressure that even its author hadn't expected to work the way it did, a political collapse that ended the fighting before the strategic situation had to be resolved. Those conditions did not repeat. Blitzkrieg was not a doctrine, it was a moment. The rest of the world spent the war learning to take it back. If the Mechelen incident never happened, does Germany win France with the original plan? Drop where you land in the comments. Subscribe if this changed how you think about what the German army actually accomplished. Thanks for watching.